Hello, everybody. Um, Very good evening. When we talk about India-China foreign policy and how China can be dealt with by India or any other country, we discuss a lot with students, and it all comes back to one question or one statement. That is, we need to understand China better, and how do we do it? So, in a way to address how and why and what is the nature of Chinese state itself, I started reading a lot and I came across this particular book, How China Sees India and the World by Mr. Shamsil, one of the very well written accounts on China, and multiple other research papers and articles. So I thought I'll present it as videos to my students. And one point to notice, this cannot be a standalone material for the examination. We have already discussed enough in our classes, and this is a supplement to what we have already seen. So let me share slides. Yes. So today we are going to look at China, whether it is a Confucian state or a confusing state. Okay, so that is what we're going to look at today. And okay, in order to understand how to deal with China, it's very, very essential to see how China sees itself because of its history, because of its own way of governance, its own cultural heritage, and all of these factors. We need to understand what it thinks about itself in order to understand how it would look at any other country in the world and how it would look at the world order itself. Okay. So, first of all, China is a country which strongly believes in discourse power. Okay. We have all heard this about discourses, building narratives. Okay. It's also a part of your syllabus in political science, that is uh, postmodernism, and where you see the power of discourses, narratives, etc., etc. China has essentially created and been successful in creating narratives. Okay, it is very, very capable of creating persuasive narratives, and that helps it mobilize and hold a lot of power. Okay, and this stems from a really long history, and we need to understand it. First thing is, they have a very serious emphasis on history. If you see all of their important documents or current Xi Jinping's statements, they have a real emphasis on going back to the old glory. Okay, and there is a lot of emphasis on history. Why? Chinese culture is essentially said to be a visual culture, meaning they use a lot of ideograms and characters. And as we all know, learning Mandarin and learning Chinese language, it's not that very easy because there are no specific alphabets. It's not like A to Z, 1 to 26 letters, right? Each character is a word in itself. And there's a lot of emphasis on written words and written records. Okay, so that culture is completely different. If you see India, it's more said to be an oral culture where we don't have that much of written records and histories, but whatever is the ancient literature or the medieval literature, there is more emphasis on the chants, there is more emphasis on the mantras, the music, the way it is delivered. And these are the things that are predominant in our works. But the Chinese history itself has that way of looking at ideograms and making sense of it, etc., etc. Okay, so from there they started that habit of writing things, okay, and writing down history for themselves. Okay, that is something for us to understand. And second, because they were able to write and record history, there came a habit of recording every single event and later on even changing them according to the needs. Okay. And one such example is the use of tributary system. So what do they mean by tributary system? This is an example cited by Mr. Shamsiran also in his book. That is, there is glorification of the Chinese Empire by showing scenes from ancient depictions where it is said that the foreign envoys, for instance, the Arab merchants or the merchants from India, they went and paid tributes to kings there, like the Liang and Qing dynasty. Okay. So even these statements are not found in Chinese literature itself, but this was put forward by Western scholars analyzing whatever evidences that they generally had. And this has been hijacked by uh, China very well. Okay. So there is nothing problematic about um, spreading the glory of their culture, but what problem does it result in? It's seen as if China is the only radiant universal empire. If they have had trade with the rest of the world, so it means that the other countries have equally contributed towards these exchanges. Exchange cannot be a one-way thing, right? And so all their pamphlets, all their historical evidences are written as though it's the center and it's always a giver, despite having no documentary evidences for such exchanges. Okay. And so this narrative has been used by China to say that China is the center of Asia, China is the center of the world. So they are capable of building narratives out of their own history. Okay. And what it results in is it makes it the organizing principle for the entire regional order or the world order. For instance, when it presumes that any country in Southeast Asia is a lesser power, there were always people who relied on China, and this is a supreme cultural sphere of that period, then it's very easy to keep a constellation of the independent nation states around you all the time. It's as if they are looking up to China. They really are looking up because of the economic hegemony that China currently has. But where does that narrative start from? So that's the uh, thing that we need to understand. So it is basically leading to a system of assumed supremacy and a system of hierarchy. Okay, listen to hierarchy, because that's where Confucianism is integrally a part of China. Okay, so we'll look at what a Confucian state looks like. Okay, so the whole world is operating with assumptions like men are born equal, everyone is capable of pursuing rationality. As your PSA students, you should be aware of all of this, right? So we see a liberal democracy and a liberal kind of now it can be said it's a neoliberal world order, but it's like liberalism is the major narrative now. So there is some amount of assumed equality of sovereign nation states, but that's not the case with Confucianism. Okay. Hierarchy is a very essential quality of any written works of Confucius. Okay. So that is why, since the period of Confucius, we are not talking about the modern nation state in China. The meritocracy in bureaucracy has been followed even by the kings themselves. Okay, so now only we see these exams for bureaucracy, etc., in modern states, but it has been a thing. Merit has been a way to align or hierarchically put people in their places, even in the earlier Chinese history. Okay, but there is another problem with understanding this. For instance, the West always reads China as a very powerful country, which is essentially, closed, and it is an oppressive state in itself, etc., etc. But if you look within a Confucian state, we will not make such judgments. Okay. Even if you see the Communist Party of China, it's not a closed system. Okay. The West looks at it as though, there is no competitor to CCP and therefore it is a closed system. There is not a good substantive democracy that's going on there because the party itself is the one which is commanding the entire space in the political sphere. But that's not how a Confucian state would look at it. Okay, according to them, CCP is a Confucian apparatus with authority, which actually allows mobility of anyone who has very good qualities and leadership to pass through every hierarchy and order. Okay, and this they call is a good hierarchy. Confucianism itself makes a distinction between what is a good hierarchy and a bad hierarchy. Okay, so they call themselves and call this kind of practices as good hierarchy, and they say it's necessary for governance. Okay, and it's very popular to make fun of China's surveillance, etc., etc. It's depicted in the Western literature and articles as though it is a 1984 George Orwell kind of a situation. But yes, there is despotism if you look from the outside, from our prisms. But if you see something in China, the Chinese people have given the public sphere to the complete authorities of CCP as well as the state. So most Chinese believe that their own prosperity and growth and development is their own responsibility. The common or the collective welfare in the public sphere is actually a space not for the individual, but for the party and the authorities of the country. That is the understanding. So the public sphere is a sphere where we see nationalism. And that nationalism is going to keep them together, and it is left to the authorities and the CPC to, keep this sphere running. So if we comment about the way the state operates, the way they have tightened their regulation, etc., etc., the Confucian state essentially makes a distinction in the public-private divide. Yes, it's there, but the Chinese population itself, in a lot of ways, have accepted it because that's the nature of the state that we have in this particular country. Not coming to the normative judgment of whether it's good or not, but that's a fact. Okay, and in a Confucian state, you only see verticality, but China can, in its rhetoric, use statements like multipolarity. When it talks about the global order, it talks about how nations have to equally take part, etc., etc. But inherently, their system promotes verticality, and there is no horizontal distribution of powers. Okay, so Confucius also said this: unite all under heaven to ensure peace and order. Okay, so this is where the centralizing tendency in China originates. So for them, peace and order is very necessary. Why? Have you heard of this thing? In China, actually, China, geographically, if you look at their history and geography, you will know that multiple ethnic groups have lived in this entire land, and multiple ethnic groups from the periphery have also invaded them and relatively ruled them for relatively long periods. But they all identify them as either Han or a non-Han, because that is the pride attached to one particular dynasty. So what about the other dynasties? What about the other ethnic groups that were there? So the problem is, because there was no longer period of peace and harmony, and they were continuously having warring states in that particular area. For instance, the Mongols continuously invaded them. A lot of people, a lot of tribes in the peripheries. So they had a perennial attack by the nomadic tribes that were surrounding China. And that's where this Middle Kingdom narrative comes in. According to them, China is a zone of cultural and civilizational success. and it is filled or covered or surrounded by less civilized people, tribes, and countries, and therefore they need to take care of these other territories around them. So they wanted peace and order. In order to have peace and order, you need to have a central authority. And in order to have a central authority, you have to build narratives that brings the collective together. And that's why everyone identified themselves as one. So just like India, they have had this alternating phase of centralization and fragmentation, but somehow they have been effectively able to remove the history of fragmentation from their history. And this brings us to the point. Now we are moving to their capacity of building narratives, to the capacity of rewriting history. Seriously, yes. That is what we call historical revisionism. Okay. So, for instance, Zhaos were one of the dynasties, and they rewrote the history of their violent overthrow by Shang when they came back. So, kings have consecutively rewritten the history to maintain their glory. And dynastic history writing was really, really a serious practice in China. Why do you think we have Huansang's accounts, Aixing's accounts, all the Chinese travelers' accounts on India and not Indian travelers? Because we did not have much of a history keeping, recording. Okay. So why did they have this? It is because the fear of the power of the past to discredit the future. So, in order to have a bright future, you need to have a bright and a stronger past. And that means you have to rewrite histories and create instances where you can unite people together for a better future. So, examples of such imagined history is there everywhere in China, and that is effectively used to seek the legitimacy of the state. How? I have given a few examples that has been quoted by the author and many other scholars. Number one, imagine the case of OBOR, One Belt, One Road, the Silk Route narrative that China has effectively built. It has been able to negotiate and tell to the Eurasian countries that it has traded silk to the rest of the world, and therefore now let's have a similar route. This is born out of no archaeological evidence. And the seaborne trade of Arabs and Indians have been completely vanished in their accounts. Okay, there is history that Calicut was used as a center from where a lot of marine expeditions of Chinese empire took place. So this has been taken away from the history, but they use that route effectively to project them as a center of Asia and therefore to project themselves as an Asian power. And also, let's look at the current example. They have what is called the century of humiliation. That is the period where the opium wars were fought, the old empires broke down, and a modern China emerged. So this is a period where China was scared of Russia, China was scared of Japan, and it was under facing a lot of threat from the British. And this has been used as a means to make mobilize people together and use it for the political purposes. Okay, the Tiananmen Square of 1989, the famous incident, it was actually a peaceful protest, but it was suppressed by violence. But it is glorified as a counter-revolutionary riot. And anyone now in China would believe it that way. But why? Again, it brings us to the question: why do you have to do this? Why do they have to rewrite history? Why is this revisionism taking place? According to them, they are actually fighting with the countries in the Westphalian nation state structure. And these countries have a national identity which is linked to a strong and a glorified national history. For instance, any reverence to the Indian constitution and the modern nation state of India comes from a sense of the glorifying the Indian freedom movement, how we bought the British, and how we had a lot of diversity but we're still together. These kind of a thing narrative is behind um, national histories of modern nation states. So while China sees this, there is a necessity to build such a narrative for their own history. There is definitely nothing wrong over here, but what's wrong? The extent of its usage. That is, currently scholars in China have come up with something called the historical nihilism. Okay, it is a tool to discard any other historical evidence that's actually challenging their own story. Okay, so how far can we go with narratives? That's a serious question. So, what began as Chinese historiography turned Chinese historical revisionism. Okay, they can alter any documents, twist and turn. And that is what has been done in borders with India, Hong Kong, the case of South China Sea, and Tibet. Name it, the dispute can see evidences of either we misunderstanding or misinterpreting their documents or them turning their words. So this revisionism is historical revisionism is actually a trait that the Chinese state has and it uses. And finally, a very integral part of understanding Chinese statecraft, the past and the present. We'll be looking at both. In the past, the Qin and Han dynasties, they focused mostly on bringing peace and order. Okay, they were the relatively successful empires in China. And what are the sources they used to create such a peaceful order in the nation, in their empires? The first one is the sage tradition of Confucianism, which we saw, it's about hierarchy, it's about merit, etc. And the second is the legalist tradition. The Confucianism is about stability. It's about political and social norms, code of conducts in order to align people and stratify the society. But a legalist tradition is about absolute authority of the ruler, and it is coupled with severe punishment in order to make people adhere to the rules. So you'll have severe punishments and violent measures to establish this particular peace and order. Okay, and therefore they have a highly centralized and a tightly controlled state. Okay, in fact, it is said by the scholars that there is not just an acceptance but even a preference for a strong authority and a leadership which tries to bring people together. Now, do you get a clue about why they do not see India as equal? That we'll be dealing with in our next video. And in the present, what China is like. Is it a communist state? Definitely not a Marxian imagination of communist state, because it has much less to do with annihilating any class difference, labor rights, etc. And economic foundation is the basis of Marxism. But China has embraced the neoliberal and the market economy route, so which is throwing away the economy part of communism. Next, is it a postmodern state? Definitely not. Just because they build discourses, they build narratives, it doesn't mean that they are postmodern, because they still believe in definite structures and hierarchies and them being the part of the top hierarchy. Okay. Is it a Buddhist or any type of civilizational state? No. Culture has been thrown via the cultural revolution that happened. So what is it? What China is like? What the state of China is like? Whether it is Communist Party that's ruling or it's the emperors who were ruling, it needs to be understood that it's actually a Confucian state, despite it having some Communist Party in power. It's a part of them. So what is it? It's a Confucian state impersonating modern nation states in the global order with its pristine Chineseness, their national identity, stemming from the camouflaged past and economic supremacy of the present. And that's what China is like. In our next video, we'll be looking at how to deal with such a China from India's perspective, Indian foreign policies perspective. And the video after that will be looking at how China perceives the world and world perceives China. Thank you.